Imagine boarding a plane, settling into the first-class seat you paid for, only to be asked politely but firmly to give it up. Not because of an emergency, not because of a mistake, but because you were seen as the one who didn't quite belong. What would you do? Would you move quietly to avoid a scene? Would you protest, raising your voice until someone listened, or would you remain seated, calm and unshaken, letting silence carry the weight of your dignity? On a quiet autumn evening, Flight 782 prepared to depart Denver for Seattle. Among the passengers was Adrian Cole, a black CEO whose presence commanded respect, though few around him knew who he truly was. When a flight attendant singled him out, asking him to surrender his seat, the air in the cabin shifted. What followed was not an argument, not a fight, but a lesson in power, dignity, and the strength to remain still when the world demands you shrink. Stay with us as we unfold a story that will make you question what respect truly means. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss stories that touch the heart and spark the mind. The late autumn sun hung low above Denver International Airport, spilling golden light across the wide runways and glass walls of the terminal. The air carried that crisp edge of November chilly, but not biting, the kind of air that makes every breath feel clean. Inside the terminal, travelers hurried between gates, some clutching rolling bags, others balancing coffee cups, everyone caught in the rhythm of departure. Among them was Adrian Cole. At 52, Adrian had grown accustomed to moving through airports like a ghost. Not invisible. No, he was too tall for that, too sharply dressed in his slate gray suit, but practiced at moving with a quiet presence. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. There was an ease about him that suggested someone who knew time bent to his pace, not the other way around. He carried only a leather briefcase, polished but well used, and a slim folio tucked beneath his arm. He had boarded countless flights over the decades: business trips, negotiations, inspections, even the occasional personal escape, but today felt different. This route, Flight 782 from Denver to Seattle, should have been routine. Yet Adrian had woken that morning with the unmistakable weight of significance pressing down on him. The terminal's intercom announced the first call for boarding. Adrian exhaled slowly, as though centering himself. For him, airports were more than transit points. They were stages where human behavior, courtesy, prejudice, kindness, arrogance played out in condensed form. He had seen people at their best and their worst 30,000 feet above ground. And he knew, deep down, that every encounter mattered. When boarding was called for first-class passengers, Adrian rose with deliberate calm. His shoes clicked softly on the polished floor as he approached the gate. The attendant at the podium barely glanced at his ticket before scanning it, offering a mechanical, "Enjoy your flight." No eye contact, no warmth. Adrian nodded anyway, a small courtesy to someone who didn't return it. Walking down the jet bridge, he listened to the hollow echo of his own footsteps. Metal walls, the faint hum of air circulation, the smell of jet fuel faint through the seams, familiar, almost comforting. He had once been a boy who dreamed of airplanes, who would sit for hours sketching wings and engines on scrap paper. Now he owned a company that manufactured them. Life, Adrian thought, is nothing if not a long circle. Inside the aircraft, first class glowed with low amber lighting. Leather seats stood in neat rows, armrests polished, the faint scent of new upholstery mixing with brewed coffee. He moved toward seat 2A, second row by the window. A good seat, private, yet not isolated. He slid his briefcase beneath the seat, placed his folio on the tray, and lowered himself with the controlled grace of someone who claimed space without apology. The cabin wasn't full yet. A young man in a baseball cap slouched into 2B. Earbuds in, eyes fixed on his phone. He didn't acknowledge Adrian, didn't even glance his way. That wasn't unusual. Adrian had grown used to the subtle avoidance, the way strangers often acted as though his presence didn't require acknowledgement. It wasn't hostility, exactly, more like erasure. Still, it carried a sting that never fully dulled. Adrian rested his hands on his lap, fingers interlaced. His mind wandered to his father, a man who had worked 2 jobs just to afford Adrian's first textbooks. His father used to tell him, "Dignity is the only luggage you carry everywhere. Don't ever check it in." Adrian smiled faintly at the memory. Those words had carried him through boardrooms filled with doubters, through negotiations where silence was more powerful than shouting. A flight attendant passed with a tray of water, offering glasses to a couple in row 1. She did not stop at Adrian's row, did not even make eye contact. He felt the flicker of disappointment rise, then carefully set it aside. He had learned long ago not to let every slight take root. But he noticed. He always noticed. Outside the window, the sun struck the tarmac at a low angle, gilding the wings of other aircraft preparing for departure. The world moved with routine precision, baggage carts rumbling, ground crews signaling with bright orange wands. And yet, within Adrian, there was a subtle current, an intuition that today would not remain routine for long. Passengers filed in steadily. Laughter, tired voices, the shuffle of bags. A businesswoman in heels, a retired couple holding hands, a teenager with a skateboard case. Every face told a story, and Adrian, as always, observed quietly, drawing meaning from the smallest gestures. It was both habit and gift, the ability to read a room without speaking. He pulled out his folio, flipped it open, and scanned a few documents. Technical reports, proposals, timelines. His company, Helios Aero Group, was preparing to unveil a new sustainable propulsion system. Revolutionary, if executed right. But he closed the folder after a minute, realizing his mind wasn't in the numbers today. Instead, it lingered on something heavier, something less definable. The intercom clicked as the cabin crew prepared for final boarding. A mother with 2 children appeared at the doorway, pausing just beyond first class. Adrian caught the brief exchange between her and a flight attendant, a whisper, a nod, nothing more. Yet he felt the shift instantly, the quiet turning of invisible gears. Adrian straightened slightly in his seat, sensing the shape of what was coming, though no words had yet been spoken. It was in the way the attendant's eyes flicked toward him, in the hesitation before she began moving down the aisle. He could already feel the weight of expectation forming around him, the familiar story beginning again. But for now, he sat still, calm, present, prepared. This was how Adrian Cole traveled not just across states and time zones, but through the constant turbulence of human assumption, always steady, always deliberate, carrying the luggage his father had named dignity. And as the cabin settled into that fragile quiet before takeoff, Adrian knew that before this plane ever left the ground, a storm would arrive inside it, a storm that had nothing to do with weather. Adrian Cole leaned back slightly in his seat, letting the muted hum of the aircraft surround him. The cabin lights glowed in soft amber, casting a warm sheen on the leather headrests and polished armrests. The quiet elegance of first class was designed to soothe, to make passengers forget the chaos of the terminal. Yet beneath that calm surface, Adrian sensed an undercurrent, subtle but undeniable, like a string pulled too tight. He placed his hands lightly on the folio resting on his lap, fingers tracing the edge of the leather cover. He had opened it earlier to review reports, but the numbers refused to hold his attention. Instead, his mind lingered on the faces around him. The man in 2B with his baseball cap still hadn't looked up from his phone. The couple in row 1 chatted with animated gestures, laughing softly. Across the aisle, a businessman scrolled through emails, lips pressed thin in concentration. No one seemed hostile. No one glared openly. Yet Adrian felt the same familiar distance. He had lived long enough to know when people considered him out of place, even if they never said so aloud. It was in the averted gazes, the way conversations hushed as he passed, the polite but hollow smiles. The flight attendant, who had breezed by earlier without offering him water, reappeared near the galley. She laughed lightly at something a passenger said, then continued down the aisle without glancing in Adrian's direction. He let out a slow breath, quiet enough that no one else could hear. These weren't new experiences. They had followed him through airports, hotels, boardrooms. Once, years ago, he had walked into a conference where every other executive assumed he was the driver for one of their colleagues. Another time, in a luxury hotel lounge, a hostess asked if he was lost. He remembered the sting, the embarrassment, but more than that, the determination that always followed. He thought of his father again, a man who never had the luxury of flying first class. His father had worked late nights at a factory, calloused hands, weary eyes, yet he had spoken with unwavering dignity. "One day, you'll sit in rooms they never thought belonged to you," his father had said. "And when you do, you don't leave just because they make you uncomfortable. You stay, because that space is yours too." Adrian closed his eyes briefly, as though hearing the words anew. He had stayed true to that lesson through decades of business battles. It wasn't always easy. The temptation to respond with anger was strong. But he had learned something else. Silence, when wielded with confidence, could be more powerful than rage. The plane filled steadily as more passengers boarded. The quiet hum of conversations layered over the rhythmic clatter of bags being stowed overhead. A child laughed somewhere near the back. A ringtone chimed before being hurriedly silenced. All ordinary sounds of a flight preparing to depart. But to Adrian, they formed a backdrop to the unease in his chest. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, glancing at the lock screen. A family photo greeted him, his daughter, now in college, smiling on a summer afternoon. She had inherited his eyes, his calm expression, though her smile was warmer than his own. He thought of the conversations they'd had recently about resilience, about navigating spaces that still weren't built with her in mind. He wanted her to know she had the right to every room she walked into, every seat she occupied. Adrian slipped the phone back into his pocket, pressing his palm against it for a moment as though anchoring himself to the thought of her. From his window seat, he looked out at the airport grounds. Fuel trucks crawled across the tarmac, orange vests flashing under the sunlight. Farther away, another aircraft began its slow taxi toward the runway, engines roaring faintly. The world outside moved with mechanical certainty, each step choreographed, each motion precise. Inside, however, unpredictability brewed. The man beside him finally shifted, pulling out his earbuds. He glanced briefly at Adrian, then turned back to his phone without a word. It was the kind of dismissal Adrian knew well, a glance that acknowledged presence but denied connection. He straightened slightly, feeling the weight of the space around him. It wasn't always this way. He remembered the first time he had flown first class, decades earlier, when he was still an ambitious young engineer trying to climb his way into a world that didn't expect him. He had been nervous then, aware of every stare. Now, after years of success, after becoming the founder and CEO of Helios Aero Group, he should have felt beyond such things. But prejudice did not care for titles. Bias didn't pause at success. It clung stubbornly, resurfacing in places as mundane as an airplane seat. Adrian inhaled slowly and opened his folio again, forcing his eyes to skim the lines of text. Technical jargon filled the pages. Efficiency ratios, material testing data, launch timelines. All important, all urgent. But his attention slipped once more, pulled back to the awareness that his seat was not simply a seat. It was a symbol, a test, a stage. He tapped a pen lightly against the margin, the soft rhythm grounding him. Then he set the pen down and folded his hands, letting the silence speak instead. A few rows behind him, a family boarded laid a man, a woman, and 2 young children. Their voices carried lightly as they settled near the curtain separating business class from economy. The mother leaned toward a flight attendant and whispered something, pointing toward the first-class cabin. Adrian noticed. His stomach tightened, not from fear, but from recognition. He knew how quickly such quiet conversations could shape the course of an evening. The attendant nodded slowly, then glanced toward Adrian's row. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Adrian caught it. He had trained himself to notice the smallest cues, the slightest shifts in attention. He turned his gaze back to the window, but every muscle in his body sharpened with awareness. The warmth of the sun on the wing outside seemed distant now, replaced by a heavier anticipation. He told himself to stay calm, to remember who he was, to remember the words of his father and the hope of his daughter. Yet inside, he wrestled with an ache he rarely admitted. Why must he always brace for these moments? Why must something as ordinary as a seat, a meal, a greeting carry the potential to become a battlefield? He swallowed hard, forcing the questions down. He could not let them spill into the open. Not here. Not yet. The flight attendant began moving toward him. Her smile was practiced, polite, but it did not reach her eyes. Adrian straightened his shoulders, his heartbeat steadying into a rhythm he knew well. The rhythm of confrontation, the rhythm of history repeating itself in countless small humiliations. He told himself one more time, stay calm, stay seated, stay dignified. Because sometimes silence was not surrender. Sometimes silence was the sharpest blade of all. And Adrian Cole, sitting in seat 2A, knew that before long the entire cabin would understand the weight of that silence. The last of the passengers were still finding their seats when Adrian Cole adjusted the angle of his window shade, letting a thin blade of golden sunlight cut across the tray table. He watched the light shift as the aircraft door closed and the faint thud reverberated through the cabin. First class was nearly full now, a collection of strangers with their own private destinations, each wrapped in a cocoon of expectation. Adrian studied the space quietly, the way he always did. He noticed how the cabin crew leaned warmly toward certain passengers, engaging them with small talk, offering subtle courtesies that went beyond the job description. He also noticed where those courtesies stopped short. He had become an expert at reading invisible lines, the boundaries of attention, the circles of assumed belonging. The attendant, Emily Foster, walked past again, her polished shoes clicking softly on the carpeted aisle. She offered another drink to the couple in row 1, adjusted a pillow for the businessman across the aisle, and smiled at the man in 2B. When she reached Adrian's row, her smile faltered into neutrality. She passed without a word. Adrian's jaw tightened for a moment, then relaxed. He knew better than to let it show. Years of practice had taught him that anger, when visible, was too easily weaponized. He leaned back, folded his hands over his folio, and let the silence shield him. Still, memories stirred. He remembered being a young engineer, traveling for the first time on a business class ticket purchased with his own savings. He had been so proud, so eager, yet the gate agent had questioned whether the ticket was really his, suggesting he might have picked it up by mistake. That moment had seared into him, not because of the accusation itself, but because of the casual certainty with which it was made, the certainty that he didn't belong. Now, decades later, he was far beyond proving himself. He owned patents that reshaped aviation. He signed contracts worth billions. He sat on boards that influenced global transportation policy. Yet here, in this quiet cabin, he could still feel the weight of that same assumption pressing against him. The man in 2B shifted in his seat and muttered something into his phone. His arm brushed lightly against Adrian's, but he did not acknowledge the contact. Adrian glanced sideways, not in irritation, but in quiet observation. He wondered, not for the first time, how many people noticed these small exclusions, how many chose to ignore them, and how many simply accepted them as the price of moving through certain spaces. A chime sounded as the flight crew prepared the cabin for takeoff. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, warm but efficient, welcoming passengers aboard Flight 782 with an expected arrival in Seattle just after sunset. The words washed over Adrian, but his focus remained inward. He thought of his daughter again, imagined her sitting in his place, imagined her navigating the same silent walls. Would she know how to hold her ground? Would she inherit his calm, or would she feel the weight of injustice more sharply? With fresher wounds, he closed his eyes briefly. His father's voice returned like an echo. Dignity is the only luggage you carry everywhere. He repeated the phrase silently, like a mantra. When he opened his eyes, he caught the gaze of a passenger across the aisle, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who quickly looked away. For a flicker of a second, he wondered if she had seen what he felt, that tension, that invisible barrier dividing courtesy from disregard. But she turned back to her magazine, leaving the question unanswered. The hum of the aircraft deepened as ground crew prepared the pushback. Adrian turned his face toward the window, watching as the sun edged lower, the light turning from gold to amber. It cast the wing in a glow that looked almost fiery. He found the sight grounding, a reminder that outside human pettiness, the world continued its vast, indifferent rhythms. Emily appeared once more, this time with a tray of menus. She handed one to the couple in row 1, another to the businessman across the aisle, and one to the man in 2B. She paused when she reached Adrian. For a fraction of a second, she hesitated, then placed the menu on his tray with a perfunctory motion. No smile, no words. Adrian thanked her anyway. His voice was low, steady, laced with a gentleness she did not return. The man in 2B glanced at Adrian briefly, then shook his head, as if puzzled by Adrian's composure. Adrian felt the scrutiny, but ignored it. He wasn't here to perform dignity for others. He was here to inhabit it fully for himself. The family that had whispered at the curtain earlier was still murmuring to another attendant, their voices carrying faintly. Adrian couldn't catch the words, but he caught the tone urgent, hopeful, tinged with frustration. He saw the attendant nod, glance toward the front of the cabin, and then walk briskly toward Emily. Adrian's chest tightened. He had seen this pattern before. A request, a negotiation, a choice about who was expendable. He told himself not to assume, not to predict, but the memory of countless similar moments made it hard to believe otherwise. He looked down at his folio again, though he didn't read. Instead, he studied the fine creases in the leather, the way time had shaped it. It reminded him of his own life, marked by years of wear, yet holding strong, perhaps even more valuable for the endurance. The captain's voice returned briefly, announcing a short delay as baggage was loaded. Adrian welcomed the pause. It gave him space to gather his composure, to breathe through the unease building inside. He inhaled deeply, counted to 4, then exhaled slowly, the way his daughter had once taught him after her first yoga class. Across the aisle, the businessman frowned at his watch. The couple in row 1 asked for another drink. The man in 2B tapped impatiently at his phone. Life went on in its small frustrations, yet for Adrian the air thickened with something larger. He told himself again, stay calm, stay grounded, stay seated. Emily and the other attendant leaned together near the galley, whispering. Adrian's eyes followed them without moving his head. He recognized the glance in his direction, quick but telling. He had been in enough boardrooms to know the look of someone deciding on his behalf. Inside, a struggle churned. Part of him wanted to preempt it, to stand up, to demand clarity. But another part, the deeper part, insisted on patience. He knew that sometimes the most powerful stance was not to move until the truth revealed itself. The engines hummed louder, vibrating through the floor, but the plane remained still. Adrian sat motionless, his hand resting on the folio, his gaze fixed calmly ahead. He could already feel it coming, the request, the explanation that would mask itself as courtesy but carry the sting of exclusion, the wall that would try, once again, to push him back. He breathed in deeply, steadied himself, and prepared, because Adrian Cole had learned long ago that invisible walls were only as strong as your willingness to retreat. And this time, like every time, he had no intention of retreating. The cabin had settled into that in-between quiet, the lull before the pushback when people tucked away their bags and adjusted their seatbelts. Adrian Cole remained still in 2A, hands folded neatly over his folio. He listened to the hum of the air vents and the faint shuffle of movement behind the curtain to the main cabin. Every sound was familiar, yet his body told him something unfamiliar was about to surface. A child's laugh broke through the hush, followed by the gentle scolding of a mother. Adrian glanced sideways, catching a glimpse of the family that had entered late. A boy no older than 6 tugged at the strap of his backpack, while his younger sister clutched a stuffed animal close to her chest. Their parents exchanged weary looks, the kind that spoke of long travel days and the impossible task of keeping children calm in tight spaces. Adrian's heart softened instinctively. He had traveled often with his daughter when she was young, had juggled juice boxes and crayons while trying to maintain a calm exterior. He understood the exhaustion that etched itself into parents' faces on travel days. But he also recognized the danger in what he saw the mother leaning toward a flight attendant, her hand gesturing toward the first-class cabin. He could not hear her words, but he knew their shape. Families needed seats together, a request for accommodation. He respected the need. What troubled him was the next part, the decision of who would pay the price for that request. Emily Foster, the attendant, nodded briskly at the mother's whisper. She straightened her uniform, smoothed a strand of hair back into place, and began walking toward the front of the cabin. Adrian followed her with his eyes, his stomach tightening in anticipation. She moved with the careful steps of someone preparing for an uncomfortable task. When she reached Adrian's row, she paused, forced a smile onto her lips, and tilted her head as if rehearsing warmth. "Mr. Cole," she began, her tone carrying a practiced politeness. "There's a family traveling with 2 small children. Unfortunately, their seats are separated in the main cabin, and they're hoping to sit together. Would you be willing to give up your seat so they can be accommodated?" Her voice was even, yet it carried an expectation that unsettled him. It wasn't a question so much as a polite directive. Adrian looked up slowly, his gaze steady but calm. He let a moment of silence stretch between them, long enough that she shifted slightly under the weight of it. "Have you asked any of the other passengers in this cabin?" His voice was soft, even, but each word landed with precision. Emily's smile flickered. "Well," she hesitated, We thought of you first because you're traveling alone. It would be easier." Adrian nodded slightly, as though considering her words, but inside something stirred a familiar ache mixed with quiet anger. He had expected it, and still the sting landed. He glanced toward the man beside him in 2B, alone and young, earbuds still hanging around his neck. The couple in row 1 were together, but across the aisle sat a businessman traveling solo. None of them had been asked, only him. Adrian turned back to Emily, his expression unchanged, but his eyes sharper now. "Easier," he repeated, or assumed acceptable. Her posture stiffened. "We just want to help the family," she said, her voice quicker now, a defensive edge creeping in. "And I respect that," Adrian replied, still calm, still composed. "But I paid for this seat. I arrived early, followed every instruction. I am not less entitled to it simply because I sit alone." The man in 2B shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. The couple in row 1 quieted their conversation, listening. Across the aisle, the businessman peeked over his laptop. A hush fell, the kind of silence that amplifies every word. Emily held her ground, but her confidence faltered. She tried again, forcing her smile back into place. "We thought you might understand. It's for children." Adrian let the words hang in the air. He did understand. He understood more than she realized. He thought of his daughter clutching her own toy years ago, and he felt empathy for the family. But empathy did not erase injustice. His voice lowered, firm yet unshaken. "If this request were made fairly, if all options were considered equally, I might feel differently. But tell me honestly, am I being asked because I am traveling alone, or because I look different from everyone else here?" The words struck like a quiet thunderclap. The passengers within earshot froze. Emily's face paled, her practiced smile collapsing into uncertainty. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. That's not what this is about," she stammered. Adrian did not move, did not raise his voice. He let the silence do the work. His gaze, calm yet piercing, remained locked on hers. The power of it made her shift her weight, her hands tightening on the folder she carried. Around them, the cabin breathed differently now. Whispers floated from behind, passengers leaning slightly to catch what was happening. Adrian could feel the shift, the invisible line of sympathy beginning to form. Emily cleared her throat, trying once more to steady herself. "We just wanted to help the family. There's no other meaning behind it." Adrian inclined his head slightly, but his voice held its edge. "Then you should ask everyone, not only me." For a moment she stood there, caught between duty and discomfort, her authority slipping in the face of his composure. Then, unable to find footing, she retreated toward the galley, leaving behind a silence so taut it seemed the entire cabin held its breath. Adrian sat back slowly, his movements deliberate, his breathing steady. Inside, however, his chest ached with the familiar heaviness. He hated these moments, not because of confrontation, but because of their predictability. He had lived too many of them, and he wondered again, as he often did, what lesson his daughter would draw if she had been here to see. The family sat quietly in their seats now, avoiding his gaze. Adrian didn't blame them. They had only asked for help. It was the system around them that had chosen who should bear the cost. He adjusted his cufflinks and looked out the window, the sunlight dimming as the day edged closer to dusk. He let the silence settle again, wrapping himself in it like armor. Because Adrian Cole knew that sometimes the refusal to move, the decision to remain seated, spoke louder than any argument ever could. And though the confrontation had only just begun, The weight of its meaning was already pressing against every soul in that cabin. The cabin carried a hush that did not belong to ordinary travel. It was the kind of silence that clung to the air after a moment of friction, when every passenger felt the weight of something unspoken. Adrian Cole sat in seat 2A, still as stone, eyes fixed on the fading light outside the window. Inside, though, his thoughts swirled like currents beneath a calm surface. He had not raised his voice. He had not argued. And yet the exchange with Emily Foster had shifted the air in a way words alone could not explain. Adrian could feel the ripples. The couple in row 1 glanced back now and then. The businessman across the aisle had lowered his laptop screen, pretending to type while his eyes flicked toward Adrian's row. Even the man in 2B, who had spent most of the flight immersed in his phone, shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension that hung between silence and confrontation. Adrian breathed deeply, steadying himself. He had been here before, in different forms, in different rooms, always the same script. The polite request that wasn't really a request. The subtle suggestion that his place was provisional, dependent on his willingness to yield. The justification wrapped in courtesy, but never in fairness. He told himself not to let the sting harden into bitterness. Yet his chest tightened all the same. It wasn't just the insult of being singled out. It was the memory of every time it had happened before, and the knowledge that it would likely happen again. From the corner of his eye, he saw Emily return. Her smile had vanished, replaced by a tight line of resolve. She carried herself with a kind of forced confidence now, as though bracing for another attempt. "Mr. Cole," she began again, her voice firmer this time, "I really need to ask you to reconsider. The family is very distressed. It would mean a lot to them if you could help." Adrian turned his head slowly, meeting her eyes. His own expression remained calm, but his gaze held a weight that unsettled her composure. "I've already told you," he said evenly. "I am not refusing to help out of cruelty. I am refusing because I have not seen you ask anyone else. You chose me first. You chose only me." She shifted slightly, lowering her voice so others wouldn't hear as clearly. "Sir, you're traveling alone. They're children. Surely you can understand." It was then that Adrian asked the question that sliced through the cabin like a blade. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried to every ear around him. "Am I being asked because I sit alone," he said, "or because I don't look like everyone else here?" The words settled into the silence like stones dropped into still water. The ripples spread instantly. Heads turned, conversations ceased. The businessman across the aisle froze. The couple in row 1 stiffened. Even the man in 2B finally tore his gaze from his phone, his eyes wide. Emily's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, closed it, then looked around as if hoping for support. None came. The weight of Adrian's question hung between them, undeniable, inescapable. "That's not fair," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "That's not what this is about." Adrian's eyes never left hers. He didn't raise his tone, didn't press the point. He simply let the silence draw out, letting the truth reveal itself in her hesitation. His composure unsettled her more than any outburst could have. The passengers felt it too. The hush was no longer just awkward. It had become a reckoning. Every person in earshot was forced to confront the possibility that the request had not been neutral, that something deeper had shaped it. Emily tried again, her words spilling quickly now. "We just wanted to help the family. There's no other meaning." Adrian gave a small nod, his expression unchanged, but his reply cut sharper than before. "You've already made this situation uncomfortable," he said quietly, "and it was not me who did that." Emily faltered, her shoulders sagging as though the strength had drained out of her. For a moment she looked less like an attendant in control of her cabin and more like someone who realized she had miscalculated. She glanced toward the galley, as if searching for an ally, and then retreated. Her footsteps hurried. Adrian sat back, adjusting the cuff of his suit with slow precision. His heart pounded beneath his calm exterior, but he refused to let it show. He could feel the eyes on him, some filled with sympathy, some with discomfort, but none could look away. Inside, Adrian wrestled with himself. He hated these moments, hated that he had to speak the question aloud. He wondered if it would change anything, or if it would simply mark him once more as difficult. Yet another note in the invisible ledger others kept about men like him. But he knew he could not have stayed silent. Silence might have spared the moment, but it would have cost him more than the seat itself. It would have chipped away at the foundation his father had laid, the foundation he wanted his daughter to inherit. He remembered her voice on the phone a week earlier, complaining about a professor who underestimated her. "I didn't say anything, Dad," she had admitted. "I just wanted to get through the class." And he had told her then, gently but firmly, "Sometimes you can stay quiet, but sometimes silence eats away at you. You have to know which is which." That memory steadied him now. He had chosen correctly. Around him, the atmosphere remained taut. Whispers floated through the rows behind him. A few passengers glanced at him with something like respect, others with unease, but no one spoke. No one dared break the silence he had carved into the space. Adrian kept his posture calm, his breathing measured. But inside, his mind was already moving ahead. He knew this wasn't over. He knew someone else would come. Supervisors rarely left such matters unresolved. And when that happened, he would need to decide again, yield or stand firm. He turned his gaze back to the window, watching as the last streaks of daylight painted the wing in soft orange. He allowed himself one moment of quiet prayer, not for himself, but for strength to meet what was coming, because he could already feel it. The next confrontation was on its way, and Adrian Cole, seated firmly in 2A, was ready. The silence in the cabin had not yet lifted when Adrian Cole leaned back into his seat. The hum of the aircraft remained steady, but the mood around him had shifted into something brittle. Passengers glanced at him, then away, unsure whether to engage or retreat into their own bubbles. The weight of his question still lingered in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Adrian focused on the steady rhythm of his breath, pulling calm from deep within himself. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone higher in the chain of command would appear. Airlines functioned on hierarchy as much as any military unit. Flight attendants reported up, and supervisors made the final call. And whenever tension arose in a cabin, it never stayed small. He turned slightly toward the window, watching as a luggage cart rumbled past, its headlights flickering in the dim light of early evening. The glow of the sun was fading, leaving streaks of amber on the horizon. Adrian always found something grounding about sunsets, the way they demanded patience. The day never rushed to end. It simply dimmed slowly, steadily, until darkness settled. He hoped to hold that same patience now. The sound of deliberate footsteps interrupted his thoughts. From the front of the cabin came a man in a tailored Navy uniform. His posture was stiff, his stride measured, his expression one of restrained authority. His name tag gleamed in the soft cabin lights, Daniel Rhodes, flight supervisor. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Conversations hushed. Passengers leaned back in their seats, curious but cautious. Daniel carried himself like a man used to being obeyed, the kind of authority that did not shout but expected compliance. He stopped at Adrian's row, clasping his hands behind his back. His tone was calm, but it carried the weight of finality. "Sir," he began, his voice clipped, "I understand there's been some difficulty with your seating." Adrian looked up slowly, his gaze steady. "There has been no difficulty. I am seated where my ticket places me." Daniel's jaw tightened. "The crew has explained that a family is separated. We are asking for your cooperation to make accommodations." Adrian tilted his head slightly. Cooperation should mean fairness. Yet no one else was asked. Only me. Daniel's eyes narrowed just a fraction, though his tone remained composed. "The request was made because you are traveling alone. We felt it would cause the least disruption." Adrian paused, choosing his words carefully. He did not want to escalate, but neither would he retreat. "I understand the family's needs, but I have also fulfilled mine. I purchased this seat, arrived on time, followed every instruction. I have done nothing to warrant being singled out." The man in 2B shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them. Across the aisle, the businessman leaned back, pretending to check his phone but clearly listening. The couple in row 1 exchanged tense glances. Daniel straightened his shoulders. "If you do not cooperate," he said evenly, "we may need to take further action. That could include asking you to deplane. I would rather avoid that, but I must ensure the flight can depart smoothly." The words landed with the force of a gavel. Passengers who had been eavesdropping now stiffened visibly. A mother in row 3 gasped softly. Everyone knew what deplane meant. Removal, embarrassment, humiliation. Adrian felt the pressure rise inside his chest, not from fear, but from the sting of recognition. It was the same tactic he had seen before, polite words masking a threat. The insinuation that his refusal to yield made him the problem. He closed his eyes for a moment, pressing his palms together lightly, grounding himself. Inside, a storm churned. Part of him wanted to stand up and argue, to unleash the years of frustration bottled inside him. He imagined himself demanding justice, raising his voice until the entire cabin knew his indignation. But another part, the part shaped by his father's wisdom, counseled restraint. His father's voice echoed in his mind. Dignity does not flinch. Adrian opened his eyes, his composure unbroken. His voice, when it came, was calm but resolute. "I have a valid ticket. I am in my assigned seat. I am not disturbing the flight or violating any rule. Remaining here is not a disruption." Daniel's lips pressed thin. For a moment, his authority faltered. He was used to passengers complying quickly, used to his uniform carrying unquestioned weight. Yet here was a man who neither shouted nor surrendered, who simply stood firm with words that were irrefutable. The cabin held its breath. Every passenger sensed the clash of wills, subtle yet immense. This was no longer about a seat. It was about principle, about who held the right to decide who belonged. Daniel leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Sir, I am trying to handle this respectfully, but if you continue, you put us in a position where we cannot depart. That will inconvenience everyone on this flight." Adrian met his gaze, unwavering. "I am not preventing this plane from departing. I am sitting quietly in my assigned seat. If there is a delay, it will be because others have chosen to make it so." The firmness of his words cut through the cabin like a clear note. The silence deepened. A few passengers nodded subtly, tiny gestures of solidarity that did not go unnoticed. Inside, Adrian wrestled with his own doubts. Would this escalate further? Would he be forced into the humiliating walk of removal? What would it mean for the company he led? the people who depended on him, the reputation he had built for a fleeting moment. Fear brushed against him, but he pushed it aside with deliberate strength. Fear could not decide his choices. He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his phone. The simple act seemed ordinary, but the timing gave it gravity. Daniel watched closely, his eyes narrowing as though bracing for confrontation. Adrian unlocked the phone with calm precision, his fingers steady. He scrolled briefly, then pressed a contact without hesitation. The line rang only once before it connected. "Victoria," Adrian said, his voice low but clear. The passengers closest to him stiffened, realizing he was speaking to someone important. "Adrian," came the response, steady and unsurprised. "What's happening?" Adrian's gaze remained locked on Daniel. His next words were soft, but they carried the weight of command. "Delay the flight." Then he ended the call, sliding the phone back into his pocket as though nothing unusual had occurred. For a moment, the cabin seemed frozen. Daniel's posture stiffened, confusion flashing across his face. Emily appeared from the galley, her eyes wide, sensing a shift she couldn't define. The businessman across the aisle lowered his phone completely now, openly staring. The couple in row 1 whispered frantically. The man in 2B pulled out his earbuds at last. The energy in the air changed. What had been a confrontation between passenger and supervisor suddenly became something larger, something none of them fully understood. Adrian sat still, calm as ever, his hands folded again over his folio. He did not need to explain. The silence spoke louder than any defense, because power, when it was real, did not need to shout. It moved quietly, decisively, altering the ground beneath everyone's feet, and as the aircraft remained motionless at the gate, every passenger began to realize that the man in seat 2A was not just another traveler. The cabin of Flight 782 had fallen into a strange quiet, the kind that hummed with unspoken questions. Engines idled outside, ready to start their climb into the sky, yet the aircraft did not budge from the gate. Passengers exchanged glances, checked their watches, and whispered speculations. No announcement had been made, but everyone sensed that something unusual was unfolding. Adrian Cole sat steady in seat 2A, his hands resting loosely over the leather folio on his lap. To the casual eye, he looked calm, even detached, as though he were simply another businessman waiting out a minor inconvenience. But those watching more closely sensed the deliberate nature of his stillness. He was not a man adrift, he was a man anchored. Daniel Rhodes. The flight supervisor remained standing in the aisle. His jaw was tight, his eyes darting between Adrian and the galley. The authority that usually carried him through disputes now felt unsteady, like a ladder balanced on shifting ground. He had expected compliance, perhaps even resistance softened by apology. What he had received instead was something altogether different. 3 words spoken into a phone, words that carried more force than his uniform. Delay the flight. Passengers hadn't missed it. Whispers spread quickly, a wave of speculation moving from row to row. Some passengers leaned toward each other, murmuring questions. Others glanced at Adrian with new curiosity, studying him as though trying to piece together a puzzle. Adrian did not move. His eyes rested on the window, where the last streaks of sunset painted the tarmac in shades of deep orange and violet. Inside, though, his mind was sharp, calculating. He had not wanted to use the call so soon, but the moment had demanded it. And now, there was no retreat. Emily Foster appeared again, stepping hesitantly from the galley. Her earlier confidence had evaporated. She stood beside Daniel, lowering her voice as though secrecy still mattered. "What's happening? Why aren't we pushing back?" Daniel gave a terse shake of his head. I don't know. Something changed. Adrian caught their exchange in the reflection of the window, but did not acknowledge it. He had learned long ago that silence unsettled those who relied on control. The less he revealed, the more they revealed themselves. Across the aisle, the businessman had abandoned all pretense of work. His laptop lay closed on his tray, and his eyes studied Adrian with open curiosity. The couple in row 1 whispered, their voices urgent but hushed. Even the children in economy, sensing something unusual, had gone quieter, their laughter replaced by puzzled questions to their parents. The delay stretched on. 5 minutes, then 10. Crew members exchanged anxious looks. The captain's voice did not come over the intercom. The door to the cockpit remained closed. The air felt charged, as though the entire aircraft balanced on the edge of revelation. Adrian shifted slightly in his seat, unfolding his hands and resting them on the armrests. His posture was composed, but every movement was deliberate, a message written without words. He was not leaving. He was not moving. Daniel finally cleared his throat. His voice clipped but strained. Sir, you understand that what you've done has consequences. We can't keep the plane waiting indefinitely. Adrian turned his gaze toward him at last. His eyes were calm but unwavering, the kind of look that unsettled men who thrived on obedience. I am not keeping this plane waiting. Choices were made that placed us here, not me. The simple clarity of his response left Daniel momentarily speechless. Emily looked away, her cheeks flushed. The minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Then the sound of footsteps approached from the front. Different footsteps measured, deliberate, carrying an authority beyond that of the cabin crew. Passengers turned their heads as 2 figures entered the aircraft, dressed in tailored company uniforms, their presence quiet but commanding. Executives. Their arrival sent a ripple through the cabin. This was no longer a matter of routine. Something significant was in motion. The first executive, a tall man with silver hair, exchanged a brief glance with Daniel before leaning down to speak softly. Whatever words were shared, Daniel's posture stiffened further, his authority shrinking. The second executive moved past him and scanned the cabin, her eyes settling briefly on Adrian before flicking away. Adrian did not flinch. He simply adjusted his cufflink as though nothing unusual were happening. But inside, he felt the shift solidify. The call had reached its mark. Victoria Lang would already be moving behind the scenes. Passengers whispered more loudly now. A man in row 3 pulled out his phone and began typing quickly, perhaps sharing the unfolding scene online. A young woman farther back angled her phone discreetly, recording video. Adrian noticed, but said nothing. The story had already outgrown the cabin. Daniel finally stepped aside, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of authority had been lifted from him against his will. Emily hovered near the galley, her eyes darting nervously. Adrian inhaled deeply, letting the air settle inside him. He thought again of his daughter. He imagined her scrolling through social media, stumbling across a video of her father sitting calmly in seat 2A while others fumbled around him. Would she understand the meaning behind his silence? Would she see strength, not stubbornness? He hoped so. Inside, though, doubt tugged at him. He knew that power, once revealed, could not be hidden again. The anonymity he sometimes cherished in travel was gone. He had stepped into the light, and with it came scrutiny, expectation, judgment. But he reminded himself this was never only about him. This was about the principle that dignity was not negotiable. If he yielded now, the lesson would echo far beyond this cabin. The aircraft remained grounded, its engines humming in idle frustration. Out on the tarmac, support vehicles sat motionless. Inside, passengers shifted in their seats, impatience mixing with curiosity, yet none dared complain too loudly. The atmosphere felt too charged, too delicate. Adrian closed his eyes for a moment, breathing evenly. He felt the rhythm of his heartbeat, steady and controlled. He reminded himself that storms did not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they moved quietly, reshaping everything in silence. When he opened his eyes again, the executives were speaking softly into radios, their tones urgent but controlled. Daniel had retreated slightly, no longer confronting Adrian directly. Emily remained frozen near the galley, her earlier certainty dissolved into anxious waiting. Adrian rested his hand on his folio, fingers steady. He had not shouted, he had not moved, and yet the cabin now revolved around him, drawn into the orbit of his refusal to yield. This was the call of power, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. And as the plane remained grounded in the fading light of evening, every soul on board began to realize they were witnessing something larger than a seating dispute. They were watching dignity sit quietly in seat 2A and refuse to be moved. The minutes passed with a heaviness that no one in the cabin could ignore. The aircraft remained still at the gate, its engines humming but never advancing. The silence, broken only by the occasional cough or the rustle of a magazine, felt unnatural. Even the children had quieted, sensing the unease that wrapped itself around every row. Adrian Cole sat motionless in seat 2A, his posture calm, his face unreadable. He had not spoken since the call. He did not need to. The ripple of his 3 words still echoed in the cabin. Passengers glanced at him as if trying to reconcile the still figure before them with the invisible force that had brought the plane to a standstill. Daniel Rhodes stood stiffly near the galley, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. Emily Foster shifted uneasily at his side, her earlier confidence reduced to nervous fidgeting. The 2 executives who had boarded moved with quiet urgency, speaking into radios, their words hushed but urgent. Then came the sound of footsteps, heavier this time. 2 crew members entered the cabin, their expressions grim. They did not look at the passengers. They looked only at Daniel and Emily. One leaned close, whispering a message that carried the weight of decision. Daniel's face darkened. Emily's shoulders stiffened. The whisper ended, and for a moment both stood frozen. Then, slowly, as if carrying the weight of shame, they began moving toward the front of the cabin. Whispers broke out instantly among the passengers. Phones appeared, some raised discreetly, others less so. The quiet drama had crossed a line. It was now becoming a spectacle. Daniel walked with rigid steps, his posture brittle, every eye in the cabin tracking him. Emily followed, her cheeks flushed red, her smile long gone. The authority they had worn like armor just minutes earlier had crumbled into silence. They did not protest. They did not explain. They simply walked out, their presence erased from the cabin as though they had never belonged there. The effect was electric. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then the whispers surged louder. Passengers leaned toward each other, some with shock, some with satisfaction, all trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Adrian remained still, but his eyes followed the scene carefully. He did not smile, did not revel in their departure. He understood what had happened, and he understood its cost. This was not triumph. It was consequence. A new set of flight attendants entered soon after. Their appearance alone shifted the energy. They carried themselves differently, with warmth instead of formality, with sincerity instead of performance. One, a woman with gentle eyes and silver strands in her hair, approached Adrian directly. Her voice was soft, respectful. "Mr. Cole," she said, "we are here to ensure your comfort. You may remain seated, of course, if you prefer. We can also arrange a private lounge for you while the flight is reset." Adrian met her eyes, searching for insincerity, but found none. He shook his head gently. "I'll remain here." She nodded, understanding. She did not argue. She simply adjusted the tray on his table as though reaffirming his right to the space he occupied. Passengers around them shifted in their seats, their expressions changing. The whispers that had once been filled with judgment or confusion softened now into something else. Respect. Some glanced at Adrian with subtle nods. Others lowered their eyes, ashamed of their earlier assumptions. Adrian felt the change, though he did not seek it. He had not come here for recognition. He had come here to travel. Yet the circumstances had transformed the simple act of remaining seated into something symbolic, something that spoke beyond the cabin walls. The plane remained at the gate, but the energy had shifted. The shame of the earlier confrontation lingered, but it was now counterbalanced by the quiet authority of Adrian's presence. Inside, Adrian wrestled with his own thoughts. He had not asked for this. He had wanted nothing more than to take his seat, open his folio, and travel like any other passenger. Yet, time and again, life reminded him that normalcy was a privilege he did not always have. His seat was never just a seat. His silence was never just silence. He thought of his daughter again, of the conversations they would one day have about this very moment. Would she see strength in his calm, or would she see the burden of always having to prove his right to simply exist where he belonged? His heart ached at the thought, but he steadied himself. He knew the answer. He knew that what he modeled here would become part of the foundation she carried into her own battles. The silver-haired attendant returned with water. Adrian accepted it with a nod of gratitude. Their exchange was brief, simple, but laced with mutual respect. Behind him, phones continued to record. He could hear the faint clicking of camera shutters, the whisper of text messages being typed. The story was already spreading beyond the aircraft. He could feel it, like the tremor before an earthquake. And yet, amid all of it, he remained still. That stillness was his anchor, his weapon, his truth. For every passenger watching, the message became clear: he had not moved. Not because he could not, but because he would not. And that difference mattered. Outside, the sun dipped fully below the horizon, leaving the tarmac bathed in deep blue shadows. The plane's cabin lights glowed softly, illuminating the faces of passengers who now carried an unspoken understanding. The removal had taken place. Authority had shifted hands. And though the night had only just begun, everyone sensed they had witnessed something they would not soon forget. Adrian Cole sat quietly in 2A, his hands folded once more, his face composed. He had not needed to fight with raised voices. He had not needed to argue his worth. He had simply remained, and in doing so, the ground had moved beneath everyone's feet. The cabin breathed differently now. Respect replaced doubt. Reverence replaced judgment. And the story of one man in one seat had begun to grow into something far larger than the walls of that aircraft could contain. The air inside Flight 782 felt different now. What had begun as tension, thick with judgment and unease, had shifted into something quieter, heavier, almost reverent. The departure was still delayed, the engines still idled without purpose, but the mood among the passengers had changed. Adrian Cole remained in seat 2A, his posture composed, his eyes resting on the darkening horizon outside the window. The sky was deepening into indigo, the last streaks of orange fading into memory. His reflection in the glass was calm, almost stoic, though his mind remained alert. He knew that silence was never empty. Silence carried meaning. And tonight, the silence carried his. Passengers around him began to look at him differently. The businessman across the aisle, who had earlier pretended to work, now studied Adrian openly. His expression was no longer skeptical, but contemplative, as if trying to piece together the kind of man who could sit so quietly, yet alter the course of an entire flight. The couple in row 1 glanced back frequently, their faces softened with a mixture of guilt and admiration. Even the man in 2B, restless and indifferent before, now shifted with unease, his earlier dismissal replaced by reluctant respect. Adrian did not revel in their changed gazes. He simply sat, grounded, knowing that dignity was not about convincing others, but about holding firm to the truth within. The new flight attendants moved with a deliberate gentleness. Margaret Hayes, the senior among them with silver strands in her hair, approached Adrian once more, this time carrying a glass of sparkling water. She set it on his tray with a sincerity that required no words. Her eyes met his briefly, conveying quiet acknowledgement. Adrian inclined his head in return. The small exchange did not go unnoticed. Passengers around them saw the difference between her manner and Emily's earlier one. They saw the respect in her eyes, the authenticity in her voice. It created a ripple of realization that went beyond Adrian himself. Behind him, whispers spread, but their tone had shifted. Instead of judgment, there was curiosity. Instead of suspicion, there was admiration. Some spoke softly about the injustice they had witnessed, others about the calm with which Adrian had met it. A young woman discreetly filming lowered her phone for a moment, her expression almost solemn, as though she recognized the weight of what she was capturing. Adrian remained still, but inside, his thoughts circled like currents beneath a calm surface. He wondered how far the story would travel once those phones left airplane mode. He wondered if his daughter would see the clips before he even had the chance to call her. The thought made his chest ache with conflicting emotions. He wanted to shield her from the burden, but he also wanted her to see that strength could exist in stillness. He thought of his father again, of long talks in the small living room of their modest home. His father had never spoken of power in terms of wealth or influence. He had spoken of it as presence. The ability to hold your place without apology. The world will ask you to shrink, his father once told him. Don't let it. Even when you sit in silence, let that silence fill the room. Adrian exhaled slowly, realizing that tonight, without meaning to, he had become his father's lesson incarnate. The cabin itself seemed to respond. The restless fidgeting of earlier had given way to stillness. The whispers had softened into contemplative quiet. Even the children, restless at first, now gazed curiously toward the front, sensing that something important had happened, though they couldn't yet name it. Adrian adjusted the cuff of his jacket, a small motion that somehow commanded attention. The businessman across the aisle straightened instinctively, as though mirroring him. The couple in row 1 exchanged another glance, but this time it was not one of judgment, but of recognition. Slowly, silently, the atmosphere in first class transformed into something like respect. Margaret Hayes returned to the galley, her steps calm, her voice gentle as she directed her team. They carried themselves differently than the earlier crew. Their movements were precise but warm, their smiles genuine, their focus evenly distributed across passengers without bias. It was as if the removal had not only cleared space, but had recalibrated the tone of the entire flight. Adrian felt it too. For the first time since boarding, he allowed himself to breathe a little deeper, yet he did not let his guard drop completely. Experience had taught him that reverence was fragile, respect could be fleeting. The lesson was not complete. He glanced once more at his reflection in the window. The face staring back was calm, but in his eyes he could see the weight of years, the endurance of countless similar battles. He wondered how many more he would face, And how many others, those without his resources, his position, his quiet authority, faced them without anyone ever seeing? That thought pressed against his heart more than any personal slight. The plane remained grounded, but the silence had changed shape. No longer awkward, it felt purposeful, almost sacred. Every passenger knew they were part of something unusual, something larger than a seating dispute. And though no announcement had yet been made, though the engines still waited idle, the story of Adrian Cole had already begun to spread, whispered from row to row, filmed on hidden phones, carried on the current of reverence that now filled the cabin. Adrian Cole sat quietly, not asking for recognition, not demanding validation. He simply remained. And in that stillness, respect grew, not because he sought it, but because he embodied it. For those who witnessed it, the lesson would linger long after the plane left the ground. That dignity does not need to raise its voice. That strength can be found in stillness. That reverence, once earned, carries farther than any shout. And in the glow of the cabin lights, passengers who had once looked at Adrian as an inconvenience now saw him for what he truly was, a man who refused to shrink, whose very presence reshaped the space around him. The plane had not yet left the ground, but the storm had already begun. It did not arrive with thunder or lightning, but with whispers, messages, and the quiet hum of digital currents spreading from the cabin into the wider world. Passengers who had captured the removal of Daniel Rhodes and Emily Foster now held glowing screens in their hands. Some were typing furiously, others discreetly uploading clips despite the weak connection that lingered before takeoff. Each post, each text, each shared video was a spark, and sparks never stayed contained. Adrian Cole sat steady in 2A, his body a portrait of composure. He had not asked for the storm, but he knew it was here. He felt it in the way passengers looked at him now, not with dismissal, but with curiosity, even admiration. He felt it in the quiet that spread behind him, the reverence that lingered in each whisper. He knew it would not stop at the cabin door. Inside Helios Airlines headquarters, more than 1,000 miles away, the storm had already reached its first target. Notifications flooded screens, alerts pinged, and the first frantic calls were made. The CEO, Victoria Lang, was pulled from a boardroom into a quiet office. There she stood, calm but alert, her sharp gaze fixed on the stream of updates flowing across her assistant's tablet. Flight 782 Denver to Seattle, her assistant explained quickly. A passenger conflict escalated. Videos are already online. The crew has been replaced. The situation is spreading. Victoria's jaw tightened. She did not yet know the full details, but she knew enough. Airlines lived and died on reputation. One video could undo years of careful branding. And the words already attached to this story, discrimination, humiliation, removal, were dangerous. Back on the aircraft, Margaret Hayes moved through the aisle with quiet efficiency. She offered drinks, adjusted blankets, and reassured passengers with a steady professionalism that helped restore calm. Yet she too knew the balance was fragile. She felt the weight of every glance toward Adrian, the sense that his presence had become larger than the cabin itself. Adrian accepted a glass of water from her, nodding his thanks. He did not speak. He did not need to. His silence had become the center of gravity, pulling everything into orbit. The businessman across the aisle finally leaned forward, speaking in a low tone. "Sir, if I may." He hesitated, then continued. "That was remarkable, the way you handled yourself." Adrian turned his head slightly, acknowledging him but not feeding into flattery. "I simply remained where I was meant to be," he said quietly. The man nodded, humbled by the simplicity of the response. Meanwhile, In the rows behind, conversations stirred. Some passengers expressed outrage at what they had witnessed, others shame for not speaking sooner. A few admitted, in hushed tones, that they had assumed Adrian was in the wrong at first, only to realize now that he had been right all along. These private confessions carried weight, though they would never be spoken to him directly. At headquarters, Victoria Lang convened her senior team in the executive conference room. The polished table gleamed under bright lights as directors shuffled in, their faces tense. Thomas Green, the HR director, carried a stack of notes. Rachel Kim, head of communications, clutched her phone, already buzzing with notifications from journalists seeking comment. Victoria wasted no time. "We are facing a cultural crisis," she said, her voice clear and firm. "This is not just about one passenger and one crew. This is about the perception of who we are as a company. If we mishandle this, it will define us." Thomas adjusted his glasses. "We need immediate investigation into crew training. Diversity, inclusion, cultural sensitivity clearly. There are gaps. This cannot happen again." Rachel leaned forward. "We also need to own the narrative before it owns us. We cannot hide behind corporate language. If we are defensive, the public will know. We must be transparent, sincere, and bold in our commitment to reform." The room filled with murmurs of agreement and tension. Victoria listened, her gaze sharp, her silence commanding. She knew this was not simply about crisis management. It was about transformation. Back on the aircraft, Adrian felt the shift. He did not know the details unfolding in the boardroom, but he sensed the momentum. Change was no longer hypothetical. It had been forced into motion, and though he had not raised his voice, his presence had become the catalyst. His thoughts turned again to his daughter. He pictured her scrolling through her phone, seeing his face in grainy video clips, hearing his calm voice repeated in captions. He wondered how she would feel. Pride, perhaps, or perhaps sorrow at knowing her father could not escape these battles, no matter how successful he became. He closed his eyes for a moment, whispering silently to himself, "Let this matter. Let this not be wasted." The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling preparation for departure, though the plane still sat idle. Margaret Hayes leaned toward Adrian once more, speaking softly. "Mr. Cole, we are awaiting clearance. I assure you, your comfort will remain our priority." Adrian opened his eyes, meeting hers with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. Her nod carried more than formality. It carried recognition. At headquarters, the meeting intensified. One executive cautioned about shareholder backlash, another worried about lawsuits, but Victoria cut through their concerns with a single statement. "The greatest liability is inaction. If we fail to reform, if we fail to protect dignity, then we are unworthy of the skies we claim to serve." Her words silenced the room. Adrian, still seated in 2A, could not hear her, yet in some unspoken way, he felt the resonance. He had spent his life building companies, leading teams, shaping culture. He knew that change rarely came from comfort. It came from disruption, from storms like this. And though he did not seek storms, he knew how to weather them. The businessmen across the aisle finally leaned back, clearly moved by Adrian's steadiness. The couple in row 1 exchanged another look, but this time with admiration instead of doubt. Even the restless man in 2B seemed subdued, no longer tapping his foot impatiently, but sitting with unexpected stillness. Reverence had not just entered the cabin, it had settled there, reshaping every interaction. Adrian Cole remained where he was, steady, calm, unshaken. He had not shouted, had not demanded. Yet the corporate storm now raging beyond the cabin was proof enough silence, when anchored in dignity, could move mountains. And as Flight 782 finally prepared to leave the ground, every passenger knew they were not just traveling from Denver to Seattle. They were carrying a story that would echo far beyond the runway, into boardrooms, headlines, and households across the nation. At Helios Airlines headquarters, the boardroom lights glared against polished wood and glass. Outside the windows, the skyline glowed with scattered lights, but inside the room, the atmosphere was far from serene. Executives sat in tense silence, their phones buzzing on the table, screens flashing with alerts. The story of Flight 782 had moved faster than any of them expected. Clips were already spreading across platforms, gathering thousands of views, then tens of thousands. Victoria Lang entered with her usual composure, her tailored jacket sharp, her eyes fierce. She did not take her seat immediately. Instead, she walked to the head of the table and remained standing, her presence commanding the room. She placed both hands flat on the table and scanned the faces around her. "You've all seen the footage," she said, her voice steady but heavy with authority. "We don't have the luxury of pretending this is minor. A passenger was targeted, humiliated, and threatened with removal. The situation escalated to the point where the crew had to be replaced. That passenger chose not to make a scene. He remained calm, and now his calm has exposed us." Thomas Green cleared his throat. "We'll begin internal investigations right away. Training modules, evaluations, performance reviews. We can suspend the staff involved," and Victoria raised a hand. "Stopping him. Suspensions won't be enough. The culture that allowed this to happen goes deeper than two individuals." Rachel Kim leaned forward, her phone still buzzing beside her. "The media already has the clips. Commentators are framing this as systemic. We need a public response within hours, not days. A holding statement now, followed by a detailed plan of reform." One executive at the far end of the table shifted uneasily. "We should be careful with language. If we admit fault too quickly, we open ourselves to lawsuits. Shareholders will panic." Victoria's gaze cut across the room like a blade. "Shareholders should panic if we don't act. Liability comes from silence and denial. Our customers are watching. Our employees are watching. The world is watching." The room went quiet again. Everyone knew she was right. Back on Flight 782, Adrian Cole sat quietly, unaware of the debate his presence had ignited miles away. The aircraft finally began its slow pushback from the gate, the rumble of the engines building as the night deepened. Passengers adjusted in their seats, the reverence still lingering. The man across the aisle gave Adrian a respectful nod. The couple in row 1 smiled faintly in his direction. Adrian returned neither gesture with flourish, only a small acknowledgement. He had not sought recognition, but he accepted their quiet respect. At headquarters, Victoria finally took her seat. "Here's what we're going to do," she began. "First, we will issue a statement tonight, acknowledging what happened, committing to full transparency. Second, we will launch an independent review of our training and customer policies. Third, we will create a new code of conduct that places respect and dignity at the center of service." Thomas scribbled notes furiously, and the staff terminated immediately. Victoria replied without hesitation. Their actions were not just mistakes. They were violations of the values we claim to uphold. Their departure will send a message. Rachel spoke again, her voice urgent. "We should go further. We need initiatives that prove this isn't temporary damage control. Scholarships, partnerships, diversity pipelines, something tangible that shows change." Victoria nodded. "Yes, this will not end in words. It will begin in action. I want a proposal on my desk by morning." The executives exchanged glances, some uneasy, some inspired. The storm had forced their hand, but in Victoria's eyes, it was also an opportunity. Adrian, seated miles away, took a sip of his water and closed his eyes briefly. He thought again of the journey, of the small indignities that had stacked up through the years, and of how this night had turned into something larger. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply sat, carrying the weight of both burden and possibility. In the boardroom, the debate continued. An older director raised a concern. If this becomes a model case, others will surface. Are we prepared to face more stories like this? Victoria looked directly at him. They will surface whether we are prepared or not. The only question is whether we lead the change or get dragged by it. Her words settled into the room with finality. No one argued further. Rachel's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, her eyes widening. It's already trending. The headline is everywhere. Black CEO asked to give up his first-class seat. They don't even know his name yet. Victoria leaned back, folding her arms. They will soon. And when they do, they'll also know how we respond. That is what will define us. Back on the aircraft, Adrian opened his folio, though he didn't truly focus on the papers inside. He let the pages sit before him as a shield, giving him the appearance of work. In truth, his mind was elsewhere, on his daughter, on his father's lessons, on the countless people who never had the chance to sit as firmly as he did in this moment. The plane lifted from the runway at last, engines roaring into the night. Passengers leaned back as the city lights fell away beneath them. Inside the cabin, the reverence held. No one forgot what they had witnessed. And in the boardroom, far below, a reckoning had begun. The night sky stretched endlessly outside the windows of Flight 782 as the aircraft leveled at cruising altitude. The hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm, a sound that usually lulled passengers into sleep or distraction. But in this cabin, no one could forget what had happened. Even as trays were prepared for service, even as Margaret Hayes and her team moved gracefully through the aisles, the memory of the removal lingered like a shadow and a lesson. Adrian Cole sat in seat 2A, his posture unchanged, his expression calm. He had not spoken more than a handful of words since the confrontation. He did not need to. Every passenger knew that the quiet figure before them was the reason the flight had taken such an unusual course. Reverence still clung to the air, unspoken but undeniable. Inside, Adrian reflected on the cost of silence. He knew some would misinterpret his calm as passivity. Others would call it pride. But he also knew the truth. Silence, when chosen deliberately, could speak louder than any argument. Tonight, it had shifted the ground beneath an entire airline. He thought again of his daughter. He imagined her sitting in her dorm room, her laptop open, her phone buzzing with messages from friends forwarding clips of the incident. He imagined her searching his face in the videos, wondering what he was feeling as he sat so still. He hoped she would see what he wanted her to see, not anger, not humiliation, but strength in refusing to shrink. Adrian's inner voice weighed heavily with questions he would never ask aloud. Why must it always come to this? Why must dignity be defended so often, so visibly? Couldn't there be a time when he was simply a passenger? No lesson to teach, no story to embody. The ache of those questions pressed against his heart, but he carried them the way he always had, quietly, steadily, as part of the weight of his life. Hours later, as the plane descended into Seattle, the city lights glimmering like scattered jewels below, Adrian prepared himself for what came next. He knew the flight itself would end, but the story would not. By morning, headlines would carry his name. By morning, the world would know. At Helios headquarters, the boardroom lights still burned. Executives remained at work long past midnight, drafting statements, finalizing policies, arguing over words that would soon be broadcast to millions. Victoria Lang stood at the center of it all, guiding with firm clarity. She knew this was no ordinary scandal. It was a reckoning. By dawn, a public statement was released. Helios Airlines acknowledged the incident, condemned the actions of the removed crew, and promised sweeping reforms. The language was clear, direct, free of excuses. More importantly, Victoria committed to structural changes, mandatory cultural competency training, the creation of a passenger dignity charter, and an independent oversight board with power to enforce it. The world responded swiftly. Some praised the decisiveness, others remained skeptical, but no one ignored it. The videos of Adrian seated calmly in 2A spread across every platform. Captions called him the man who wouldn't move. Commentators spoke of dignity, strength, and systemic change. For once, the narrative was not about an outburst or a confrontation, but about the quiet resolve of a man who simply refused to surrender what was rightfully his. In the weeks that followed, the reforms at Helios began to take shape. Employees at every level went through new training programs. Town halls were held where staff shared stories of bias they had witnessed or experienced. Policies were rewritten, codes of conduct restructured. The culture of the airline began, slowly but meaningfully, to shift. Adrian did not make himself the face of the reform. He declined interviews, issued no public statements beyond a single line shared through Helios communications. Dignity is not optional, it is owed. That was all he needed to say. For him, the true measure of change was not in headlines, but in practice. It was in the way a future passenger of color might be greeted without suspicion. It was in the way a lone traveler would no longer be singled out simply for appearing different. It was in the quiet respect that would grow, slowly but surely, into something permanent. On a quiet evening weeks later, Adrian sat in his study at home, the city lights twinkling beyond the window. His daughter sat across from him, her phone in her hand. She had seen all the videos, read all the commentary. Now she looked at him directly, her eyes filled with questions. "Did you know it would happen like this?" she asked softly. Adrian smiled faintly, his expression thoughtful. "I knew something would happen. I didn't know how far it would go. I only knew I couldn't move." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm glad you didn't." Her words warmed him more than any headline ever could. At Helios headquarters, Victoria Lang continued to lead the transformation with resolve. She knew the airline's survival depended on trust, and trust could not be restored with promises alone. It required accountability, transparency, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. She often thought back to that night, to the quiet passenger who had forced her company into a moment of reckoning. Without raising his voice, he had reshaped the path of an entire organization. For Adrian, the flight remained a memory, but not one he carried with bitterness. He carried it as proof that strength need not roar, proof that silence, when chosen, could thunder louder than rage, proof that change was possible, even in spaces built to resist it. In the end, the story of Flight 782 was not about humiliation. It was about transformation. It was about a man who refused to surrender his dignity, and in doing so, became a symbol for everyone who had ever been told to shrink, to move, to yield. Adrian Cole's journey was more than a flight. It was a legacy, a reminder that respect cannot be begged for, only claimed. A reminder that power need not shout to be real. And as the world repeated his story on phones, in newsrooms, in conversations across dinner tables, the lesson endured. Sometimes the greatest revolution begins with a man who simply stays seated. What began as a single request for a man to move from his seat became something far larger, a mirror held up to the way dignity is too often denied, and the quiet power it takes to hold your ground. Adrian Cole never raised his voice, never shouted his worth. He simply remained seated, and in that stillness he reshaped not only a flight, but an entire company. This story is not just about one man in first class. It is about all of us, about every moment when someone is told to step aside, to yield, to accept less than what they deserve. It reminds us that silence, when chosen with strength, can echo louder than anger. That dignity is not optional. It is a right. As you carry this story with you, let it stir compassion, let it sharpen your sense of justice, and let it remind you to never shrink when you know you belong. If this story touched you, share it. If it inspired you, press like. And if you believe dignity should never be negotiable, subscribe now so you can walk with us into the next chapter of stories that matter.